The cold that January was a living thing with teeth. It came down from the high peaks and settled into the prairie like a predator, claiming territory, turning the world into a place where every breath carried the risk of frozen lungs, and every exposed inch of skin paid tribute in pain. The sky hung low and colorless, pressed down by the weight of winter until it seemed the earth and heaven had become a single gray tomb. Hanyahaka, long shadow to the Lakota, who had known him since childhood, rode north along the creek, with his collar turned up against wind that cut like glass. 32 winters had marked him in ways both visible and hidden, and the scar that split his face from temple to jaw, the careful wariness in his dark eyes, the economy of movement that spoke of a man who had learned that survival required constant vigilance. His bay-gelding red smoke moved beneath him, with the fluid grace of a creature born to this harsh country breath, coming in rhythmic clouds that froze instantly in the air. They followed the creek that had sustained his people for generations beyond counting. The elders spoke of a time when this water ran so pure you could see every stone on the bottom, when fish were so thick you could scoop them with your hands, when children drank freely without their parents watching with fearful eyes. That time had ended. Halfway to Stone Bridge, the rough mining town that had erupted from the earth like a wound after silver was discovered in the mountains, Red Smoke's gait changed. The smooth four-beat rhythm broke into something irregular, hesitant. The gelding's head came up sharply, ears pinning back against his skull. Hanyahaka felt it through his seat before he saw it. He swung down in one fluid motion, his moccasins breaking through the crusted snow with a sound like bones snapping. The wind immediately drove cold through his buckskin leggings and wool shirt scavenged from a trading post, worn until it molded to his body like a second skin. He lifted Red Smoke's right foreleg with practiced gentleness, and what he found made his jaw tighten until the scar on his face pulled white. The fetlock was raw meat. Skin blistered and eaten away in a perfect circle, hair dissolved as if by acid flesh beneath weeping clear fluid that should have been blood. It was not a burn from fire or rope. This was something else, something that had come from the water itself. Red Smoke trembled, nostrils flaring wide as he tested the wind. From downstream, carried on air so cold it seemed to shatter against Hanyahaka's face, came a smell that made his stomach clench. Metallic, bitter. Wrong in a way that spoke to some ancient part of the brain that recognized poison before understanding it. In his mind, unbidden, came the image of 3-year-old Winyan, daughter of his cousin, coughing until black fluid stained her lips and chin. Of the horses in camp that had drunk from this creek and now stood with their heads hanging, legs trembling, foam gathering at their mouths like the death sweat of fever. Of the council 3 nights ago, where the elders had spoken in hushed voices about the water that had turned to poison, since the white man Conrad Fitch had driven his mind deeper into the mountain's heart. Dr. Martin Keene, the town physician who treated Lakota and white alike, one of the few who still saw people instead of profit, had spoken to Hanyahaka in the trading post 2 weeks past. The doctor's hands had shaken as he held a bottle of creek water up to the light, showing how it caught the lamp glow with an oily sheen. Quicksilver. Martin had said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mercury. They use it to separate silver from ore. In small amounts, it makes men wealthy. In larger amounts. He had not finished the sentence. He had not needed to. Hanyahaka wrapped Red Smoke's injured leg with a strip of soft leather, murmuring words of comfort in Lakota, the language his mother had sung to frightened colts when he was small enough to hide beneath their bellies. As he secured the binding and loosened the reins to check his work, Red Smoke jerked his head free with startling violence and screamed a high-piercing whinny that carried across the frozen landscape like a knife-cutting silk. An answer came from somewhere ahead. Faint but distinct, a mare's call, nervous and questioning. Before Hanyahaka could reclaim the trailing reins, Red Smoke bolted. The gelding took off up a narrow side draw driven by instincts older than human understanding, the need to find others of his kind, to seek shelter to survive. Honyahaka cursed in Lakota and ran after him, boots breaking through wind-packed snow lungs, burning with each inhale of air, so cold it felt like swallowing knives. The land rose sharply. His thighs screamed with effort. Sweat broke out on his back despite the cold immediately beginning to freeze against his skin. He crested a low ridge and stopped so abruptly he nearly fell breath, coming in harsh gasps that hung in the air like ghosts. Below, sheltered in a hollow against a dark wall of pine, stood a log cabin. Gray smoke curled from a crooked stovepipe, the only movement in a landscape that seemed frozen into absolute stillness. A brown mare stood tied near the porch, stamping at the snow with the restless energy of a creature that sensed wrongness in the air. And in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of lamplight that seemed impossibly distant and unreachable, stood a white woman. She wore a heavy wool skirt that spoke of town origins and a dark shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her face was pale in the weak winter light, not the pallor of fear, but of exhaustion held at bay by sheer will. One hand rested against the doorframe. The other hung at her side, hidden in the folds of her skirt, and Honyahaka knew with absolute certainty that it gripped a weapon. Her stance was wrong for a frightened settler awaiting rescue. This was the posture of someone who had been waiting for trouble and was prepared to meet it with lead and fire. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind sighed through the pines. Red smoke whickered nervously to the mare. The woman's eyes, even at this distance, Honyahaka could see they were dark and hard, as Flint tracked every detail of him with the assessing gaze of someone who had learned to calculate threats in the space between heartbeats. When she finally spoke, her voice carried across the clearing with surprising strength, and edged with something that might have been exhaustion or rage or both. "You picked the wrong stretch of country to trespass, friend." Honyahaka raised one hand, slowly palm open in the universal gesture of peace, while his other hand held Red Smoke's trailing rein. "My horse smelled yours," he said in the careful English he had learned at missionary school before fire had consumed the building and his formal education both. The creek burned his leg. I followed to understand why. At the word burned, something shifted in the woman's face. Not fear recognition, or perhaps the confirmation of something she had already known but hoped was not true. She stepped forward into the full light, and Honyahaka could see her clearly now. Perhaps 30 years old, though, hardship had carved lines around her mouth and eyes that made precise age difficult to judge. Dark hair pulled back with ruthless efficiency. A face that might have been handsome before whatever had happened to put that particular kind of exhaustion behind her eyes. Capable hands, one still on the doorframe, the other still hidden. She studied Red Smoke's ruined fetlock with an intensity that suggested she understood exactly what she was seeing. Then her gaze returned to Honyahaka, cataloging the rifle slung across his back, but not gripped the way he held himself with careful stillness that spoke of control rather than submission. The scar that marked him as someone who had survived violence and might survive more. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, still wary, but with an edge of something else. Decision, perhaps, or desperation making choices that caution would have rejected. "Bring him around back. Quick, and keep your voice low. I have more than one secret hidden here, and men looking to find them." The cabin's interior hit Honyahaka like a physical blow, not from warmth, though the small stove radiated blessed heat, but from the meticulous organization that spoke of someone living in a state of constant preparation for flight or siege. Supplies lined the walls with military precision sacks of cornmeal, stacked just so cans of beans arranged by size blankets folded into identical squares. Weapons were positioned within arm's reach of every strategic point, a shotgun leaning near the door, a box of cartridges on the rough table, a skinning knife laid out beside a tin basin of water that had frozen solid overnight. But it was the narrow bed against the back wall that drew Honyahaka's attention and held it. On that bed lay a Lakota boy, and recognition hit like a fist to the gut. Dasan, 16 years old, from the northern band that camped 3 valleys over. One of the young men who had taken work at Conrad Fitch's silver mine, drawn by promises of cash wages that could buy rifles and winter supplies, drawn by the desperate mathematics of survival in a world that was shrinking year by year. Dasan's wrists were wrapped in clean linen that someone, the woman Honiahaka, realized had changed recently enough that the bandages were still white. But beneath those wrappings, he could see the edges of blistering that looked exactly like Red Smoke's injured leg. The boy's lips were cracked and stained a deep purple-black, the color of old bruises, the color of mercury poisoning that Dr. Martin had described, with shaking hands and haunted eyes. Each breath Dasan took was a struggle, a wheezing inhale that seemed to scrape the boy's lungs raw, followed by an exhale that rattled like stones in a can. The woman Adelaide Ward, though Honiahaka did not yet know her name, spoke without preamble. Her words clipped and spare as rifle shots. 3 nights ago, he collapsed behind the stamp mill at the mine. His hands were blistered raw from shoveling chemical sludge that had overflowed from the waste pit. When Conrad Fitch's foreman, a piece of work named Dark Dave, ordered the guards to dump this boy back at your camp to die out of sight, I put my pistol against Dave's head and informed him that if he moved before the boy was loaded into my wagon, I would paint the snow with his brains. She gestured toward a leather-bound ledger on the table, its cover water-stained and worn from handling. I took that too. Volume 3 of Fitch's mine accounts. 3 years of mercury purchases, waste disposal costs, and a rather interesting list of workers who stopped collecting their wages. Honiahaka moved to the bedside with the economy of someone long accustomed to sick rooms, to deathbeds, to the particular stillness that comes over a body when life is deciding whether to stay or go. He placed his hand on Dasan's forehead, and the heat that radiated from that young skin was like touching sun-baked stone in August. Fever burning the boy from the inside, consuming him. The child stirred faintly at the touch lips, moving without sound, eyelids fluttering but not opening. Beneath the lids, Honiahaka could see rapid movement, the boy dreaming, or perhaps hallucinating mercury dreams in mercury darkness. I have kept him alive with boiled water and carbolic solution. Adelaide continued, and now Honiahaka could hear the exhaustion threaded through her controlled voice like dark veins through marble. But I am no physician. He needs more than I can provide. And Conrad Fitch is looking for his ledger with the kind of determination that suggests he understands exactly what it contains and what it could do to him if it reached the right hands. She paused. And in that silence, Honiahaka heard what she did not say. When he finds this cabin, when he finds me, he will not come with lawyers and warrants. Outside, the brown mare's soft whinny cut through the cabin's close air like a warning bell. Then came the sound that made Adelaide's hand drop to the pistol in her skirt pocket and sent Honiahaka to the side window in 3 silent strides, hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving with the deliberate purpose of men who had a destination and business to conduct when they reached it. Honiahaka angled his body so he could see through the gap in the shutters without presenting a target. 3 riders circled the clearing with the careful movements of predators, establishing a perimeter. They wore heavy coats that bore the stamp of mine property wool purchased in bulk, distributed as uniform. Rifles lay across their saddles with the casual readiness of tools used daily. The lead rider was a man who would have been impossible to mistake, even in a crowd of 1,000. Dark Dave, so called for the black beard that covered most of his face, and perhaps also for the quality of cruelty that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stove. His face was a map of old violence scars from knife fights, a flattened nose that had been broken more than once, eyes that held all the warmth and mercy of January ice. "They found us," Adelaide murmured, her voice controlled but tight as a drawn bowstring. "And they did not bring a warrant or a friendly word." Hanyahaka's mind worked with the speed of long practice cataloging tactical realities, with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive through cavalry charges and winter hunts gone wrong. The cabin was solidly built logs, thick enough to stop most rifle rounds, but it had only 2 exits and limited firing positions. If Dave's men established a crossfire and simply waited, it would end in starvation surrender or a final desperate charge that would end with bodies cooling in the snow. "Back door?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Adelaide nodded toward the kitchen wall. "Opens to the trees. Maybe 40 yards to the creek beyond." Honyahaka did not waste time on discussion. He moved to the bed, wrapped Dasan in the thickest blanket within reach, and lifted the boy onto his shoulder with practiced care. The child weighed almost nothing, all fevered bone and wasting muscle light as a bundle of kindling. Adelaide grabbed the ledger and thrust it into a canvas satchel, along with bottles of medicine and clean bandages, then jammed handfuls of extra cartridges into her apron pockets, with the efficient movements of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind until it became muscle memory. Outside, Dark Dave's voice cut through the cabin walls, rough and mocking pitch to carry. "Mrs. Adelaide Ward, I know you are in there, and I know you have property belonging to Mr. Fitch. Send out the ledger and the dying redskin, and you walk away from this. You have my word as a gentleman." Adelaide's eyes flashed with something that might have been fury or bitter amusement. She said nothing, knowing his word was worth exactly as much as his title of gentleman, which was to say less than the snow melting beneath his horse's hooves. Hanyahaka eased the back door open, with agonizing slowness, wincing at every creak of leather hinges that sounded impossibly loud in his ears. Wind immediately drove snow into his face, with stinging force, momentarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, he could see red smoke among the dark pines, shifting his weight nervously. And beyond the trees, the creek, half-frozen, treacherous, giving off that faint metallic smell that now seemed to carry a promise of death. "The ravine on the far side will hide us," Hanyahaka whispered, "but the ice—" "I know," Adelaide cut him off, voice tight. "I have watched it thin for 3 days." The crack of gunfire split the morning like the world breaking in half. Dark Dave's men had spotted movement through the back window. Heavy rifle slugs punched through the log walls with enormous force, sending splinters flying like shrapnel, smashing dishes and furniture with casual violence that suggested bullets were cheaper than patience. "Move," Adelaide hissed, and they ran. Hanyahaka led the way, Dasan's weight bouncing on his shoulder with each stride, the boy's labored breathing hot against his neck, even through the blanket. Adelaide followed 3 steps behind, one hand gripping the satchel with the ledger, the other holding her small pistol ready, not raised, but ready. More shots. A bullet tore through Adelaide's shawl with a sound like cloth ripping, passing close enough that she felt the wind of its passage against her shoulder blade. Another kicked up an explosion of snow at Honyahaka's feet, close enough that ice fragments peppered his legs through the buckskin. The creek lay ahead, its surface glinting dully in the weak winter light, looking almost peaceful, except for that faint, wrong shimmer that spoke of poison dissolved in the water, seeping up through ice. Honyahaka thrust the end of a rope at Adelaide. He had knotted it hastily around Dasan's chest, creating a crude harness, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second. No words. None needed. If the ice broke, if he went through, she would pull the boy to safety. That was the arithmetic of survival. He stepped onto the frozen surface, and the groan that rose from beneath his feet was like the earth itself protesting. The ice held but barely, and he could feel through his moccasins how thin it had become, how close to catastrophic failure. He moved with the patience of a man crossing snow bridges over crevasses that drop into nothing, weight distributed as broadly as possible, each foot placed with agonizing care testing before committing, mind empty of everything except the next step and the next breath. Behind them, Dark Dave's men reached the tree line. Rifles cracked again, the reports echoing flatly across the frozen landscape. Bullets whined through the air like furious wasps. Adelaide followed onto the ice, moving faster than wisdom suggested, because fear and necessity were stronger than caution. Her boots slipped. She caught herself, knees bending instinctively to lower her center of gravity, arms extended for balance. Red smoke, driven beyond endurance by gunfire and panic, and the desperate need to follow his master, lunged onto the ice. The surface shattered. The sound was not loud, almost gentle really, like glass wind chimes breaking, but the result was catastrophic. The bay gelding plunged chest-deep into water, so cold it stopped being water and became something else, something that killed in seconds, that turned muscle to stone and blood to sludge. Red smoke screamed a sound of pure animal terror that cut through the gunfire and the shouting and Adelaide's own sharp cry of alarm. Hanyahaka's body reacted before his mind had time to process. He threw his weight backward, boots scrabbling for purchase on fracturing ice, both hands locked on the lead rope with grip that would sooner break bones than let go. The muscles in his shoulders and back screamed protest. His boots began to slide toward the hole, toward the black water that promised oblivion. Adelaide, already on the far bank with her boots sunk into frozen mud, looped her section of rope around the nearest pine trunk and threw her entire body weight against it, leaning back until her spine curved like a drawn bow, the hemp line cutting through gloves and into her palms with pain that was distant and irrelevant. For one infinite moment, they were connected, warrior, woman, child, and horse, linked by rope over ice, too thin to hold them over water, too cold to survive. If red smoke went fully under, if the current caught him and pulled, they would all follow into mercury darkness. Honyahaka shouted in Lakota, "Iyuha!" a command Red Smoke had learned as a colt, and jerked the lead rope hard to the left toward a dark shape barely visible beneath the surface. That might be a rock, might be salvation. The gelding understood. Through panic and cold that must have been turning his blood to ice, Red Smoke found some last reserve of strength and lunged toward that darker patch. His hooves struck stone hidden beneath water. He lunged again, scrabbling, screaming, and then he was up, tumbling onto the far bank in a shower of spray that froze before it hit the ground. Water streaming from his coat and forming instant icicles along his belly. They did not pause. Could not pause. Bullets still flew, though the angle was wrong. Now the shots going wide as the ravine's rising ground, and thick pines cut off clean lines of fire. Honyahaka hauled Dasan up the slope, his own breath coming in gasps that burned his throat, his legs trembling with exhaustion, and the first edge of hypothermia. Adelaide followed, one hand still gripping rope, the other clutching the satchel against her ribs so tightly the ledger's corners would leave bruises that would take weeks to fade. They vanished into the ravine's sheltering throat, and behind them, Dark Dave's men stood at the creek's edge, watching, calculating whether pursuit was worth crossing that treacherous ice. By the time they decided, it was not the fugitives were gone. The journey to the Lakota winter camp took hours that felt like days. The temperature had dropped with the sun's westward climb, a cruel paradox that turned the coldest part of the day into early afternoon. Their wet clothes froze solid. Adelaide's skirt became a cage of rigid wool that scraped her legs raw with each step. Honyahaka's coat stiffened until it felt like wearing armor made of ice. Only Dasan, wrapped in dry blankets and carried in Honyahaka's arms, was protected from the worst of the cold. By the time the camp came into view, 20 lodges arranged in a protective crescent in a river bend, smoke rising from their peaks like prayers, Adelaide had stopped shivering. That was the dangerous stage, the point where cold stopped being painful and became seductive, where the body started making decisions the mind did not endorse. The appearance of a white woman being led into camp by one of their own warriors drew immediate hostile attention. Hands went to weapons. Voices rose in sharp question and accusation. An old woman, Gola Honyahaka's aunt, though Adelaide did not know that, yet spat deliberately into the snow at Adelaide's feet. Honyahaka spoke rapidly in Lakota, his voice carrying authority earned through survival and judgment trusted by his people. Gola helped carry Dasan to the central fire, but her eyes never left Adelaide, and the look in them was not simple hostility. It was the accumulated rage of years of children, coughing blood of promises broken of land, stolen one treaty at a time. She brings one poisoned child now. Gola said in Lakota, her voice sharp enough to cut. After her people poisoned, how many first, and how many more will die from what she brings with her? Adelaide could not understand the words, but she understood perfectly. She met Gola's gaze without flinching, without apology, and knelt beside the fire. With hands that trembled from cold rather than fear, she unwrapped Dasan's bandages, exposing the chemical burns on his wrists and the terrible purple-black staining around his mouth. The gathered people fell silent, studying the evidence of what the mine had done. Dr. Martin Keene arrived at dawn the next morning, having ridden through the night on a borrowed horse, after a young Lakota scout pounded on his door in Stone Bridge. Martin was 43, hollow-cheeked from too many missed meals and too much worry, with hands that still moved with gentle certainty despite exhaustion that had carved itself into his bones. He examined Dasan with thorough care, pulse at throat and wrist, breathing through a stethoscope that looked incongruous in this setting, the color of gums and tongue, the temperature of skin. When he finally looked up, his face was grave. "Mercury poisoning," he said quietly in English for Adelaide and Honyahaka, then repeating in halting Lakota for the elders. "If Fitch is dumping waste into the creek, everyone drinking from it is at risk. This boy—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "This boy may not survive despite our best efforts. But if we stop the source, others can be saved." Adelaide opened the stolen ledger with steady hands. The pages were filled with her own precise handwriting. She had been Fitch's bookkeeper for 3 years, after all recording his sins in neat columns without fully understanding what those numbers meant until it was too late. Barrels of quicksilver purchased and delivered. Tons of ore processed weekly. Wages paid to workers who had names and families and lives beyond the mine. But scattered throughout were pages in different handwriting, Valentine's cramped, hurried script. The mine's engineer had documented chemical spills, unauthorized trenches dug too close to the creek workers reporting illness. Notes dated and specific. And then several pages torn out cleanly, leaving only ragged edges. "I kept these books for 3 years. Adelaide said, her voice controlled but carrying an edge of something that might have been shame or fury or both. "I wrote these numbers without understanding their cost. Fitch ordered mercury in quantities that made no sense for the mill's capacity. I questioned it once, and he told me to mind the columns, not the business. But Valentine—" She touched the torn edges. Valentine understood, and now Valentine is missing. Martin studied the ledger, then looked at the poisoned boy, then at the circle of faces watching with varying degrees of hope and hostility. Judge Halloran arrives in Stone Bridge in 4 days to hold territorial court. He is a federal appointee, not beholden to local interests. With proper evidence, this ledger, my medical testimony, sworn statements from ranchers about dying livestock, he cannot ignore it. Fitch will not allow that ledger to reach any judge. Adelaide said flatly. "You saw what he sent after me. Then we do not give him the opportunity to stop us," said a new voice. Carl Jensen pushed into the circle, a Norwegian homesteader in his late 30s, with work-hardened hands and an accent that turned his English into something musical. His weathered face was grim with anger, barely held in check. "My 3 best milk cows died last night along the creek. Foam at their mouths, eyes gone, white bodies rigid before I could even get them moved. I have 2 more dying now." His voice roughened. "I came to this valley to build something for my children. I will not stand silent while Conrad Fitch turns it into a cemetery for his profit. Over the next 2 days, an unlikely alliance took shape. Other small ranchers arrived drawn by word, spreading through the valley, men who depended on the creek and had no other water source for their stock, who had dismissed earlier complaints from Indians and troublemakers, but could not ignore the evidence of their own dead cattle. Meanwhile, disturbing news arrived from the mine. Valentin had not been seen in over a week. The last person to speak with him was Zakhar, a taciturn Russian gunman who handled enforcement for Fitch and owed him substantial gambling debts. When questioned, Zakhar would not meet anyone's eyes, and guilt sat in his face like a physical weight. In Stonebridge, Sheriff Quiet Will tried to navigate between law and survival. He warned Dr. Martin to stop causing trouble, but his heart was not in the threat. Martin told him with quiet precision exactly where he could go. The plan crystallized high Dasan in the camp, where Fitch would not dare raid, openly keep the ledger moving between trusted hands, and ride to Stonebridge with testimony and evidence the moment Judge Halloran opened court. But the tension between Honyahaka and Adelaide remained sharp as unsheathed blades. "Your people wrote the treaties that stole our land," Honyahaka said one night as they sat watched together on the prairie, sharing a small fire while scouts patrolled the darkness for Fitch's men. "Your people brought the law that says we do not own the water we have drunk for 1,000 years. And your people killed settlers who had nothing to do with those treaties." Adelaide replied without heat, stating fact rather than accusation. "Killed women who had never voted, children who had never held office. We defended what was ours. So am I." She turned to look at him directly, firelight catching in her dark eyes. "That mine poisoned my brother, along with your people. This is not about justice for others. This is about the fact that I wrote the numbers that paid for murder, and now I have to write the numbers that will hang the man who gave the orders." They fell silent, but it was a different silence now, not hostile, but heavy with shared recognition. After a long moment, Adelaide's gaze drifted to the scar that split Honyahaka's face. She did not ask, but he saw the question anyway. "Fort Laramie 7 years ago," he said quietly. "A cavalry saber. The soldier holding it was 18, maybe 19. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped his weapon before the charge. When the blade cut me, I saw his face, saw how frightened he was, how young. I let him live. His officer called him back before I had to kill him. Why spare him? Because he was a boy following orders he did not write, fighting a war he did not start." Honyahaka's voice was quiet but firm. "We do not choose all the wounds we carry, but we choose who we become after they are given to us." Adelaide studied his face in the shifting firelight, something in her expression softening almost imperceptibly. She nodded once slowly, and the silence that followed was more comfortable than anything that had come before. The trust between them grew through necessity rather than affection. When ambushers struck 2 days later, 3 of Fitch's hired guns opening fire from concealment near Flint Rock, Honyahaka reacted with the speed of long practice, yanking Adelaide bodily from her saddle before the first shot hit its mark. They rolled down a steep slope together, his body instinctively curving around hers, taking the worst of the impacts against his back and shoulders. They ended up behind a boulder breath, coming hard, the ledger crushed between their chests, faces inches apart. For one heartbeat they were still, and Adelaide felt the solid weight of him, and the heat radiating through wet clothes, the sharp focus in his eyes, as he calculated angles and odds. Then he rolled away, tossed her his spare rifle, and took up his bow. Adelaide caught the weapon without fumbling, brought it to her shoulder, and fired. The recoil punched her shoulder hard, but she worked the lever action smoothly, ejecting the spent shell and chambering a fresh round, firing again. Her shots were not fancy, but they were controlled, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down, buying seconds that might mean survival. When Carl and two ranch hands appeared on the opposite ridge and flanked the ambushers, driving them into retreat, Honiahaka noticed Adelaide had reloaded his rifle before returning it. Her cold, numbed fingers had moved faster than thought muscle memory from hours of practice he had not witnessed. Later, checking each other for wounds in the aftermath, Adelaide saw blood seeping through Honiahaka's legging. "You are hit. Grazed. It will keep." But he let her clean and binded her hands gentle but sure, and neither mentioned how their positions had reversed from that morning at the cabin, when he had carried the poisoned boy, and she had held the ledger. They were becoming something neither had intended: a unit, a team, two people learning to fight as one, because survival demanded it. Judge Cyrus Halloran arrived in Stone Bridge on a Friday afternoon, riding in a sturdy coach with federal seals on the doors that marked his authority as something transcending local politics and local money. He was 58, with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that had presided over too many frontier disputes to be easily swayed by passion over evidence. The courthouse was a drafty timber building that served double duty as land office and courtroom. In its largest room, with a stove laboring against the January cold, Halloran listened to their case with the patient weariness of a man who knew that justice on the frontier was more often wish than reality. Dr. Martin gave sworn testimony about mercury poisoning, describing symptoms in clinical detail that left no room for doubt about the source. Carl Jensen testified about dead livestock, his voice rough with anger barely held in check. Other ranchers corroborated 8 dead cattle, 2 dying horses' water that left a metallic taste in the mouth and an oily sheen in the bucket. Adelaide presented the ledger, her voice steady as she walked Halloran through the numbers. Volume 3 covers the past 18 months. In that time, Conrad Fitch purchased 240 flasks of quicksilver, that is approximately 20,000 pounds of mercury. According to the mill's processing records, which I also kept, the stamp mills processed roughly 180 tons of ore per month. Standard amalgamation requires about 2 pounds of mercury per ton of ore processed. By that calculation, Fitch needed approximately 4,300 pounds of mercury for legitimate operations. She looked up, meeting Halloran's eyes. That leaves nearly 16,000 pounds unaccounted for. And here, she turned to pages marked with torn edges. Engineer Valentine documented where some of that excess went. Overflowed waste pits, unauthorized trenches dug toward the creek drainage, workers falling sick after exposure. Then these pages were torn out and Valentine disappeared. Halloran frowned, studying the ledger carefully. Numbers can be mistaken, Mrs. Ward. Ranchers sometimes exaggerate losses when seeking compensation. Miners move from camp to camp for better wages. He leaned back. Before I authorize a federal inspection that will disrupt operations and payroll for half this valley, I need more than suspicious accounting and circumstantial testimony. Adelaide had been prepared for this, and she reached into her satchel and withdrew a small piece of paper, torn from a ledger page found hidden beneath a loose floorboard under Valentine's drafting desk. On it, in the engineer's cramped handwriting, Shaft 3 repurposed per CF Orders 11 to 12. No longer mining. Disposal only. Materials: ink, chemical waste, contaminated equipment, biological material. Strongly object. Will not certify. She placed it on the table in front of Halloran. Biological material. That is how Valentine wrote human bodies when he could not bring himself to write it plainly. The room went very quiet. "And where is this engineer now?" Halloran asked. "Missing for 9 days," Dr. Martin said quietly. "No one has seen him since he had a public argument with Fitch about safety certifications." Halloran studied the scrap of paper for a long moment, then looked up at Adelaide. "You are accusing Conrad Fitch of murder. I am presenting evidence and asking you to investigate." Adelaide replied evenly. "Valentine wrote that note. Valentine is missing. And I know Conrad Fitch well enough to understand what happens to people who become inconvenient to his operation. That afternoon, Halloran authorized a search party, Honiahaka Adelaide Carl, and 2 federal deputies. They rode back to the remote cabin through cold that made the previous week seem mild by comparison. Behind the cabin's woodpile, Carl's cattle dog began to bark frantically and dig at packed snow. What they uncovered made even the deputies' men who had seen claimed jumpers shot and horse thieves hanged step back with pale faces. Valentine's body frozen solid, his beard crusted with ice and his own dried blood. The back of his skull had been cracked open by a heavy blow, a rifle butt perhaps, or a length of iron pipe. Adelaide knelt beside the body and searched his coat pockets with hands that trembled. She found a letter folded and unfolded so many times, the creases had nearly torn through. It was addressed to Valentine's sister in Denver, but never sent. In it, he detailed his refusal to sign false safety certifications, his fear of what Fitch will do with sick men he dismisses as useless mouths, and his knowledge of bodies being disposed of in Shaft 3. The last paragraph included a rough map showing the shaft's location and a plea, "If something happens to me, please see that this reaches federal authorities." They brought Valentine's body back wrapped in canvas, secured to a pack horse. Judge Halloran, confronted with a corpse, physical evidence of mercury poisoning, and now a written confession from a murdered engineer, made an extraordinary decision. He would convene a field hearing at the mine itself in 2 days' time. The risk of inaction of violence spiraling beyond control now outweighed the risk and hardship of winter travel into the mountains. Federal subpoenas will be issued for Conrad Fitch and his foreman. Halloran announced, "I will travel under armed escort with my seal and authority. If there are bodies in Shaft 3, we will know it. If waste is being dumped into public waterways, we will document it. The law is not perfect, but it is all we have between civilization and chaos." Conrad Fitch received the news in his office, overlooking the mine's main shaft. For a long moment he said nothing, staring out the window at the operation that had made him wealthy beyond the dreams of most men. Then he turned to Dark Dave and spoke 3 quiet words. "Bring me leverage." They came in the dead hour before dawn, when cold is deepest and sleep is heaviest. Dark Dave and 6 hired guns, all hard men who had done worse things for less money, swept down on the Lakota camp with oil-soaked torches and loaded weapons. 2 lodges at the southern perimeter burst into flame simultaneously. Canvas that had been treated with tallow for waterproofing caught instantly, sending columns of fire leaping into the darkness. Orange light danced across snow, throwing wild shadows that turned the camp into a nightmarish landscape of flame and motion. In the confusion and terror, people erupting from lodges, children screaming, dogs barking, the mounted men struck. They fired pistols into the air to scatter defenders and drove straight for the river's edge, where Gola's 10-year-old grandson, Chatan, had gone with another child to break ice for morning water. Honiahaka exploded from his lodge at the first screams, rifle in hand, still shirtless, despite cold that bit into bare skin like teeth. He saw immediately what was happening and sprinted toward the river, but there were 50 yards to cover, and the raiders had the advantage of horses and surprise. Dr. Martin, who had been sleeping near the central fire to monitor Dasan, threw himself across a 6-year-old girl as a rider raised his pistol. The bullet meant for the child punched through Martin's left shoulder, instead spinning him to the ground in a spray of blood that steamed in the frozen air. Honiahaka fired, running a difficult shot made nearly impossible by darkness and motion. But his bullet took one raider in the chest, dropping the man from his saddle. He worked the lever action to chamber another round, but his wounded thigh from the earlier ambush chose that moment to buckle, sending him to one knee. The raiders grabbed Chatan and vanished into darkness, the boy's screams cut short by a hand clamped over his mouth. By the time the camp could organize pursuit, they were gone. As dawn broke gray and bitter, they counted the cost. 2 lodges destroyed. Dr. Martin badly wounded but alive, being tended by Winona with poultices and prayer. 3 warriors injured in the fighting, including Honeyahaka, and 1 child taken. At mid-morning, a single rider approached under white flag, a dirty strip of cloth tied to a rifle barrel. Zakar sat his horse with the posture of a man carrying guilt like stones in his pockets. His message was simple, delivered in heavily accented English without embellishment. Fitch says bring the ledger and the sick boy to the mine when the judge comes. The child we took will be returned unharmed when Fitch has his property. Do not bring the child or the ledger, and the boy hangs from the headframe before the judge arrives. The camp erupted into fierce, barely controlled argument. Young warriors demanded immediate war. They would ride to the mine in overwhelming force, take back Chatan, and burn Fitch's operation to the ground. Several men began gathering weapons, ignoring the elders' calls for patience. Carl and the ranchers were equally furious. This is kidnapping under federal jurisdiction, Carl said, voice tight with rage. We ride with you. If Fitch wants blood, we will give him more than he can stomach. Adelaide stood near the wounded Dr. Martin, and for the first time since Honeyahaka had met her, her hands were shaking not with fear, but with rage so intense it seemed to vibrate through her whole body. She wanted to ride to the mine alone, walk into Fitch's office, and empty her pistol into his skull until the hammer clicked on empty chambers. Honeyahaka forced himself upright, despite the reopened wound in his thigh, which had bled through the fresh bandage and was soaking his legging with warm wetness. His leg threatened to buckle, but he locked his knee and refused to sit. Zakar, still mounted under the white flag, spoke again before anyone could act. Storm coming tonight. Big one. He gestured toward the northern sky, where dark clouds were massing like an invading army. If you ride blind with rage, the mountain will kill you before you ever reach the mine. Fitch is counting on that. He paused, and something in his face, shame perhaps, or the last remnant of conscience, made him add quietly, I will guide you if you go smart instead of angry. But I will not guide you to your deaths. Judge Halloran, informed of the kidnapping by a breathless messenger, faced an impossible choice. Cancel the hearing and admit federal authority meant nothing in the face of private violence, or proceed and gamble with a child's life while risking a massacre that would bring army intervention. After an hour of tense deliberation, they forged a plan, born of desperation, travel to the mine as a combined force. Lakota warriors, armed ranchers, federal deputies, protecting Judge Halloran Adelaide, carrying the ledger Honeyahaka leading despite his wound, and Zakar riding as guide. Arrive before the worst of the storm, conduct the hearing in the open, with multiple armed factions present to prevent slaughter, and in the chaos of legal proceedings, attempt to recover Chatan by force or negotiation. It was held together by hope so thin it was nearly transparent. As they prepared to ride, Adelaide pulled Honeyahaka aside. She pressed a small photograph into his hand, a young man with her eyes, and an earnest expression dressed in Sunday clothes that looked uncomfortable on his lean frame. My brother Emil, she said quietly, having to push the words past something blocking her throat. He took work at the mine last spring. Promised me he would save enough for his own homestead by fall. His letters came regularly for 6 weeks, then stopped. I kept telling myself he had just moved to a different camp, found better wages. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But I knew in my bones, and I kept writing those cursed ledgers anyway, because I told myself I had no proof, no evidence, and suspicion was not enough to risk my position. Honeyahaka studied the photograph, a young man barely past 20 with Adelaide's dark eyes and the kind of hope in his face that comes from believing the world is fundamentally fair. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat against his heart. "We will find him," he said. "Not you will ask him yourself," because they both knew that was almost certainly a lie. Just the simple promise that Adelaide would have answers, whatever those answers cost. They rode into the mountains as the storm built behind them, great banks of black clouds rolling down from the peaks like a slow avalanche of darkness. The temperature plummeted. Snow began to fall first in scattered flakes that drifted lazily, then in thick curtains, then in driving walls that reduced visibility to the length of an outstretched arm. Honyahaka's wounded thigh was a constant brand of fire, pulsing with each heartbeat, sending hot lances of pain up into his hip and down to his knee. Blood seeped steadily through the bandage, and he could feel it running warm down his leg before freezing against his skin. He rode without complaint, jaw locked, knowing that any sign of weakness would be seized upon by those on both sides who doubted this plan could work. Adelaide rode near the center of the column, one hand resting on the saddlebag containing the ledger. The leather-bound book had become more than evidence. It was a covenant, a promise written in ink and blood, and she would deliver it to Judge Halloran or die trying. The higher they climbed, the worse conditions became. Wind howled down from the peaks, with physical force driving snow horizontally, turning the world into a white void, where sky and earth became indistinguishable. Riders had to follow the horse directly ahead by sound and faith, trusting Zakhar's knowledge of the mine roads to keep them from wandering over cliffs they could not see. Hours blurred together. The cold stopped being sensation and became environment of the default state of existence. Adelaide's hands went numb inside her gloves. Honyahaka's wounded leg became a distant throb pain, pushed so far down he almost forgot it was there. The horses moved like ghosts, breath freezing instantly in plumes that disappeared into the white. By the time they spotted the mine's headframe rising like a skeletal hand through the curtains of snow, it was early afternoon, but dark as dusk. The storm had arrived in full fury. Figures moved like shadows near the mine entrance. Fitch's men, at least a dozen, maybe more rifles, held ready faces, obscured by scarves and low-pulled hats. Near the base of the headframe, barely visible through the driving snow, stood a wooden platform used for raising and lowering equipment into the shafts. On that platform, small and terribly exposed, stood Chatan. A rope was looped around the boy's neck, not tight, not yet, but there, unmistakable, held by a guard who stood close enough that any rescue attempt would end with the child hanging before anyone could reach him. Judge Halloran called for parley, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Conrad Fitch emerged from the shelter of a supply shack coat buttoned to the throat, face pale but composed eyes bright with the calculation of a man who believed he still held the winning hand. "This is madness, Your Honor," Fitch called out, having to shout to be heard over the storm. "You drag federal proceedings up a mountain in a blizzard, disrupting honest commerce that feeds half this valley because of a hysterical widow and some questionable bookkeeping. I have built something here, something that brings prosperity and civilization to a wilderness. Consider very carefully what you destroy before you proceed." Judge Halloran ignored the appeal. In a voice trained to carry in courtrooms, pitched now to cut through wind, he began reading the formal charges: unlawful disposal of toxic materials, in violation of territorial law against poisoning public waterways, criminal negligence, resulting in death or injury, suspicion of murder in the death of Valentine Kasparek, and obstruction of federal investigation. Adelaide dismounted and stood beside the judge, the ledger clutched against her chest. Honyahaka positioned himself slightly ahead, and to her left, rifle held loosely, but ready dark eyes scanning the assembled guards for the first flicker of hostile movement. The hearing began, a surreal exercise in frontier law, conducted in a blizzard with a kidnapped child's life hanging in the balance. Under Martin, pale and wounded but resolute, gave testimony about mercury poisoning. Carl testified about dead livestock. Adelaide presented the ledger, her voice steady, despite wind trying to rip words from her mouth, walking through the discrepancies in mercury purchases. Conrad Fitch responded with smooth denials that carried the polish of long practice. Accidents happen in mining. It is the nature of extracting wealth from stone. Men get sick from hard work and bad habits. This engineer, Valentine, was known to drink heavily and make wild accusations when his designs were questioned. These ledger entries could have been altered after the fact. And the boy supposedly poisoned, he could have been contaminated anywhere. You cannot prove the source. Back and forth. Testimony and rebuttal. Evidence presented and challenged. All of it conducted in driving snow that was rapidly burying the world in white, with a child standing on a platform with a rope around his neck, with armed men on both sides whose fingers were growing numb on triggers. The tension stretched like wire being drawn too tight. Tempers frayed. Hands drifted toward weapons. The moment was poised on a knife's edge between law and slaughter. Then a nervous young guard on Fitch's side, watching Lakota warriors spreading out along the ridge above the mine, interpreted the movement as an attack preparation and panicked. He fired his rifle not at anyone, just into the air, a warning shot, or perhaps just fear finding release. The blizzard swallowed the sound and hurled it back as chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions simultaneously. One of Judge Halloran's federal deputies was hit immediately, the heavy slug spinning him backward into the snow, where he lay still, blood spreading in a dark stain that the falling snow rapidly covered. Horses reared and screamed, eyes rolling white with terror. Men dove for cover behind ore carts and supply crates. The careful order of the hearing dissolved into the brutal chaos of a firefight, where every person on that mountainside was one trigger pull from death. On the platform, Chatan stumbled as the guard holding his rope jerked in surprise at the sudden gunfire. The rope tightened around the boy's neck. He tried to catch himself, boots slipping on ice-slicked boards, and his small body began to slide toward the platform's edge. "The platform!" Honyahaka shouted, but Adelaide was already moving. She ran through the storm with bullets whining past her head, like furious hornets' boots slipping on ice breath, coming in gasps that froze in her lungs. A round tore through her coat sleeve, the heat of its passage scorching her arm beneath. Another kicked up an explosion of snow at her feet. She did not slow. She hit the platform at a dead run and threw herself at the guard holding the rope. They went down in a tangle, her momentum carrying them both into the rough planks. The man outweighed her by 80 pounds, but surprise was on her side. She drove her knee into his groin with all the force of desperation, and when he doubled over, she slammed the butt of her pistol against his temple hard enough to crack bone. The rope went slack. Chatan collapsed to the platform, gasping, small hands clawing at the noose around his neck. But Adelaide's victory lasted only seconds. Dark Dave appeared through the storm like a nightmare, given form, rifle raised, murder in his flat eyes. He fired. The bullet caught Adelaide in the right side, just below her ribs, spinning her half around. She went to one knee, the world turning gray at the edges, warmth spreading across her belly that was her own blood soaking through wool and cotton. Honyahaka saw it happen. Saw Adelaide go down. Saw Dark Dave working the lever action to chamber another round. Saw Chatan frozen on the platform between them. Time seemed to stretch, to slow, to become something elastic and strange. Honyahaka's wounded leg was screaming, his vision tunneling from blood loss and cold, but his hands moved with the certainty of a lifetime of practice. He raised his rifle, settled the front sight on Dark Dave's center mass, an impossible shot in this wind, at this distance, through driving snow, and fired. The rifle bucked. The shot seemed to disappear into the white chaos. Dark Dave staggered backward, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. He dropped his rifle, looked down at himself with an expression of genuine surprise, and collapsed into the snow. Adelaide was still moving despite the wound in her side. She grabbed Chatan, sawing at the rope around his neck with her pocket knife fingers slippery with her own blood. The rope gave. She shoved the boy toward the nearest rancher, Carl, materializing out of the storm like an answer to prayer, and tried to stand. Her legs would not hold her. She sat down hard, one hand pressed against her side, where blood was pumping out between her fingers with each heartbeat. Near the mouth of Shaft 3, Conrad Fitch was making his final gamble. In the chaos of gunfire and storm, he had slipped toward the shaft entrance where weeks ago he had ordered dynamite planted as insurance against exactly this scenario. If evidence could not be hidden, it could be destroyed. He struck a match, hands shaking from cold and fear and the adrenaline of a man watching his empire crumble. The match guttered, died. He struck another. This one caught, and he touched it to the fuse that had been waiting in the darkness. The fuse sparked, caught, began its race toward the charges that would bring the mountain down. Honiahaka saw the spark even through the storm, understood immediately what it meant. Without conscious thought, driven by something deeper than reason, he sprinted toward the shaft entrance despite his wounded leg, trying to buckle with each step. Adelaide, sitting in the snow with one hand pressed against her bleeding side, saw him run toward the mine and understood his intent. She tried to shout a warning, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper lost in the wind. Honiahaka plunged into the shaft entrance, into sudden relative silence, where the storm's howl became muted into darkness, lit only by the racing spark of the fuse burning toward charges he could not yet see. He ran deeper, legs screaming protest, lungs burning. The fuse was secured to a support beam, 3 sticks of dynamite wired together, spark racing along the powder-impregnated cord with terrible inevitability. He grabbed the fuse and yanked. It held secured with wire. He pulled his knife and began sawing frantically at the cord. But the blade was dull, and the fuse was thick, and the spark was so close he could feel its heat on his hands. From behind him, limping out of the darkness on a bleeding leg that matched his own, came Adelaide. She held her knife in one hand and pressed the other against her wounded side, and without a word, she grabbed the fuse above where he was cutting and sawed with sharp, desperate strokes. The 2 blades working together cut through in seconds. The fuse separated the live end, with its racing spark falling away into darkness. The dynamite sat inert, harmless, its thunder stolen. For a moment, they knelt together in the darkness of the tunnel, both bleeding, both gasping for air, looking at each other with something that might have been understanding or might have been the simple recognition that they were still alive, when by all rights they should have been dead. Then Adelaide's strength gave out. She collapsed against Honiahaka's shoulder, and he caught her awkwardly, his wounded leg folding beneath their combined weight, so they both went down in the dust of the tunnel floor. Outside, Judge Halloran had finally brought order to chaos through the simple expedient of bellowing, "Federal court is in session. Anyone who fires another shot will hang for murder." With such authority that men on both sides hesitated long enough for reason to reassert itself. The shooting sputtered, died. Guards looked at each other uncertainly. Conrad Fitch, seeing his final gambit, had failed, seeing his foreman dead in the snow, and his men outgunned, slowly raised his hands in surrender. Over the next hours, as the storm gradually eased, the truth of Shaft 3 was brought into the light. Work crews entered cautiously, shoring up tunnels as they went. What they found silenced all argument and turned even the hardest stomachs. Barrels of mercury waste split and leaking poison into groundwater. Bodies, 14 of them, in various stages of decay. Mexican miners who had demanded back wages. Irish immigrants who had complained about safety. A Czech man who had threatened to write authorities in Denver. 2 Lakota men who had asked to be paid for water rights. And Emil Ward, Adelaide's brother, still wearing the cheap pocket watch she had given him, found tangled with 3 other bodies near the bottom of the shaft, where waste had been systematically dumped. Adelaide, being treated for her gunshot wound by Dr. Martin while sitting in the shelter of a supply shack, was told by Judge Halloran himself. She took the news with dry eyes, having already known in the way that grief knows before confirmation arrives. She accepted Emil's pocket watch when they brought it to her, held it in her palm for a long moment, then slipped it into her pocket and turned her attention back to Judge Halloran. "Make sure you document everything," she said, voice steady despite the pain radiating from her side. "Every body, every name we can identify. They all deserve to be found." But the final revelation came when a young deputy examining horses in the mine's corral with an eye trained by military service noticed something odd about their brands. "Your Honor, these animals have government stamps. Fort Ellis quartermaster marks." Halloran examined the brands himself, then turned sharply to Adelaide. "Does your ledger account for these horses?" Adelaide, despite her wound, reached for the satchel containing the ledger. She flipped to the section marked Livestock and Transport, ran her finger down the columns, and her eyes narrowed. According to this, Fitch purchased 30 horses from Fort Ellis at government auction last year. But the prices listed are roughly half of market rate for cavalry remounts. And there are no auction receipts attached, which there should be for any government sale. She looked up at Halloran, understanding dawning in her eyes. He was not buying them. He was stealing them, bribing a quartermaster, falsifying purchase orders, and pocketing the difference. Halloran's face darkened with an anger that transcended the case he had thought he was adjudicating. "Sir," he said, turning to Conrad Fitch, who sat under guard with his hands bound, "you have just elevated yourself from territorial criminal to federal prisoner. This now involves theft of U.S. Army property, which brings the Inspector General's office into play. What had begun with a poisoned creek and a murdered engineer had just revealed itself as something far larger. A web of corruption reaching into federal military procurement devastation of the land and water and murder, on a scale that shocked even the hardened frontiersmen present. The trial of Conrad Fitch consumed 3 weeks of late winter, drawing spectators and journalists from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. The courthouse in Stone Bridge had never seen such crowds, such attention, such meticulous documentation of evil done for profit. The evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Martin testified about mercury poisoning with clinical precision that left no room for doubt. Carl Jensen and 11 other ranchers testified about contaminated water and dead livestock. Adelaide, still recovering from her gunshot wound, walked the jury through the ledgers with methodical thoroughness, explaining every discrepancy, every missing worker whose final wages had never been collected, every barrel of mercury that had disappeared into the creek. Zakar testified about disposing of bodies in Shaft 3 on Fitch's direct orders, his heavily accented English carrying the weight of confession that sought some small measure of redemption through truth. A Fort Ellis quartermaster facing his own court-martial admitted taking bribes to falsify horse purchase records, 50 animals stolen over 2 years, the paperwork made to look like legitimate government auctions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned with guilty verdicts on 14 counts of murder, criminal negligence, causing death, theft of federal property, and obstruction of justice. Judge Halloran sentenced Conrad Fitch to hang. The sentence was carried out on a cold morning in October, witnessed by a crowd that included Lakota elders, ranchers, townspeople, and Adelaide Ward, who stood silent and still throughout. When it was done, when Fitch's body hung limp beneath the gallows, she turned without a word, mounted her horse, and rode back to the settlement that had begun growing between Stone Bridge and the Lakota camp. The mine was shuttered by federal order. The land and water would take years, perhaps decades, to heal. Workers scattered, some to other camps, some to homesteads on land they could finally afford to purchase. with back wages the court ordered paid from Fitch's seized assets. Ranchers began the slow work of fencing contaminated creek sections and mapping clean water sources, hiring Lakota scouts at fair wages to identify springs that fed from higher elevations. Dr. Martin established a permanent clinic in a sturdy log building halfway between town and camp, hiring Winona as a full partner to combine traditional Lakota healing with modern medicine. Over spring and summer, the valley healed. Children stopped coughing blood. Horses regained strength. Fish returned to pools where water ran clean. It was not quick and it was not complete, but it was real. By late summer, a permanent settlement had taken shape in the middle ground between Stone Bridge and the Lakota camp, a deliberate choosing of neutral territory. 5 cabins stood now, plus a trading post, a shared corral, and a meeting hall, where disputes were settled with words and witnessed agreements instead of bullets and blood feuds. Adelaide built herself a small cabin there, solid and well chinked against weather, with windows facing east to catch morning light. She kept Fitch's ledger locked in an iron box beneath the floorboards, not as a trophy, but as a permanent record of what happened when corruption went unchecked, and when people chose profit over conscience. She did not remarry. Offers came from townsmen and ranchers alike, but she declined them all with quiet courtesy. On Sundays, she walked to the cemetery on the hill, where Emil lay buried beside the other victims of Shaft 3, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses that bore their names. She left wildflowers when the season allowed, and in winter she simply stood in the cold and remembered. The gunshot wound in her side healed slowly, leaving a scar that pulled tight when she moved wrong, a permanent reminder of the day she had run into gunfire to save a child who was not her own from a people who had every reason to hate her kind. Honyahaka continued living on the edge of both worlds. He spoke for his people in settlement councils, his voice calm, but carrying authority that even prejudiced ranchers had learned to respect. He rode with scouts, teaching younger warriors the old skills, while also teaching them English and the rudiments of contract law, knowing that survival in this changing world required multiple kinds of strength. He and Adelaide worked around each other nearly every day. They repaired fences together. They sat in council meetings, sometimes on opposite sides of arguments, always listening before speaking. They shared meals without ceremony, discussing water rights and winter supplies, and the 1,000 practical matters of making a community function. The relationship between them deepened, slowly built on shared survival rather than romance, on mutual respect rather than passion. There were no declarations, no promises of forever. Just the steady accumulation of days worked together of trust, earned through action, of understanding, built through shared scars. One evening in late August, as the sun dropped toward the western peaks and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, they stood together at the corral fence, watching red smoke roll contentedly in the dust. "He led you to me," Adelaide said quietly, studying the bay gelding whose injury had started everything. A burned leg and a frightened mare's call. Strange how a horse's instinct changed so many lives. "Not strange," Honyahaka replied, the ghost of a smile touching his scarred face. "Necessary. A horse seeks water. Poison must be stopped. People survive by standing together against what threatens all of them." He paused. "The rest is just wind and fortune." Adelaide laughed, a genuine sound, surprised from her the first time he had heard it without bitterness or exhaustion behind it. They stood in comfortable silence as darkness gathered. Red smoke trotted over to the fence, nosing Honyahaka's hand for the apple piece he usually carried. The warrior stroked the bay's scarred foreleg, feeling new hair beneath his fingers, the brand still visible, but faded a reminder of corruption uncovered. "No more creek water for him," Adelaide said. "No," Honyahaka agreed. "Not until the land heals itself. That will take years." "We have years." Behind them, smoke rose from settlement chimneys, carrying the smells of evening meals. A child laughed somewhere. A voice sang in Norwegian, while another joined in Lakota, the languages weaving together in unexpected harmony. Adelaide pulled Emil's watch from her pocket. She carried it always now, and opened it to look at his young face and the photograph inside. After a moment, she closed it gently. "Justice is cold comfort," she said, "but it is better than none." "The ledger is closed," Honyahaka said. "The accounts are settled. What comes next is not yet written." "Then we write it," Adelaide replied, "with clean water and honest hands." As full darkness fell, they walked together toward her cabin, not touching, but moving in the same direction. Two people bound by shared trauma and survival by testimony given, and justice served by the simple fact that they had stood together when standing alone would have meant death or defeat. The valley would remember what had happened here in scars and healed wounds in ledgers, kept honestly in water, tested before drinking in graves on the hill where victims rested beneath carved names. But it would also remember the alliance that had formed between people, with every reason to remain enemies who had chosen through necessity, and then through something approaching respect to become neighbors, then allies, then something more difficult to name, but easier to live. The ledger of corruption had been closed. The water was slowly healing, and two people brought together by a horse's injury and a mare's call had built something fragile, but real, not love in any simple sense, but something perhaps more durable, partnership forged in fire, trust earned through blood, and the quiet certainty that some battles are worth fighting together.